Thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is my first time doing a lightning lesson with Maven, and also my first time doing a course with Maven. I've got a workshop kicking off this weekend. But fundamentally, really excited to try this out and see how it goes. So please keep questions as we go here. I'm going to try to talk for about 20 minutes and leave 10 at the end. We'll see exactly where we land. But would love to answer some questions and go deeper on any of this stuff. This is really, again, just scratching the surface of what we're going to get into in the workshop, which goes a lot deeper into workflows and some other things. Today, we're really going to focus on agent coding. So let me get my screen share going and we will get started. Okay, and again, just pardon me as I admit people as we come. Okay, you're here, I hope, to learn about coding with AI agents and all the things that go along with that. As an icebreaker, just as a first thing to think about, you and your head of HR are attending a concert. What band is playing? Obviously, I am grabbing the moment here, but if you can just say your favorite band and throw it in the chat, that would be a great way to start. I will say I think that I would choose Cake, which is one of those bands where you should feel a little trashy attending the concert in the first place. Love Cake, saw them as a teenager, but you know, you and your head of HR are there. You can kind of know what's going on. All right, so I see New Order, Radiohead. Ooh, Radiohead's a great choice. That's you know, you wouldn't be embarrassed to be caught at a Radiohead concert, just maybe with your head of HR. The Refused. I don't know them, and I should know them. I was a college radio DJ, so that's embarrassing, Mike. I apologize. Anybody else? All right, keep them coming. I'll try to call them out as we go. But nice way to get started. And Rolling Stones, that's a good one. Obviously, part of the reason that I brought that up is because there's some vibe coding that has sort of caught on after the Coldplay canoodlers, as they're called, and this is just a great example of like the sort of dumb thing that would never have happened before it was possible to use AI to code something, but now that it has happened, is kind of fun. If you haven't played this, it's kind of great for about 30 seconds, and then you'll move on with your lives. But the reason that I think this is all interesting is because nobody really knows how to build with AI yet. Scott is a friend, so I feel okay sort of ripping this off with attribution. I love this framing, right? The future of software really might kind of just be jazz, right? A lot of improvisation. There is a playbook. Sometimes you have to follow the playbook. If you're in a symphony, there's reasons to do that. You get a better product and nobody dies. But the idea that, you have, sorry, I'm going to admit somebody else from the waiting room here. The idea that you have this great experiment that no one is actually running the same way. I think that's a really great way to frame it. And what even is programming anymore? I ask myself that a lot. So let's keep going here. My goal for the next few minutes is just to give you a bunch of things to think about. I'm not going to tell you how to write code. I am a former engineer, but I would not call myself a current engineer necessarily, not in the way of, here's how to write great code. I'm not going to tell you which tool I think is absolutely the best. I am not going to, make sure that you don't accidentally kill something, in your production environment, which does very much happen. But I'm going to show you something about how I do it. And my hope is just that this gives you some things to think about and some confidence as you go and try to build stuff. Okay, so really quickly about me is really just that I've done a little bit of a lot of different things. Engineer first, product second, engineering manager, corp dev. I've been a consultant, off and on for a long time. I'm still, I think, intellectually and maybe spiritually more of a product guy, if I had to really classify it. But I'm doing a lot of engineering work now, and in particular around these 0 to 1 builds, which we'll get into. But really, I think the things that are most interesting for this moment about me, I was an English major. I was computer science English double, but like that's pretty relevant these days. There's a lot of value in being, a good talker, a person who understands, how to talk, in either longer conversations or in different structured forms. Very relevant to this stuff. I have written code by hand, right? I don't want to hide the fact that like, I was an engineer, right? I am not showing up and saying, I was an English major and now I can do all this stuff. The things you've done in the past do matter, right? And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Sorry, I'm still admitting folks in the waiting room. I also spent a long time as a manager. This is interesting because if you think about what managers have to do, it's both relating with people, right? It is having these conversations and sort of helping people through, tricky spots. And it's figuring out how to farm tasks out, right? How to make a big team work together, right? And the biggest teams I've had were really cross-functional. It was product engineering, designers, data science, PMO, like all sorts of stuff. So the experience doing that is pretty relevant to this moment. I've also worked at all levels of scale, but I spend a lot of my time on 0 to 1. And that's one reason this stuff is really useful for me, right? If I was working entirely on legacy code bases, if I was working in really large teams, I know I would have struggled to do some of the things that I'm doing here, at the same level. But what I'm doing now is mostly 0 to 1. And I am pretty good at a bunch of the stuff that actually happens, in the deployment side, right? Not great. Like, I'm not a person who's going to go and be a certified AWS person, but I know what's going on, right? And so fundamentally, all of these things are helpful, right? They are not required, but they are definitely helpful. Okay, let me keep going here. Let's get into it. So I just want to make a couple of really quick points, and then we'll get into the meat of it. Um, there really is something different going on here, right? I don't think I have to convince you of this if you're coming to this lesson, but the idea that people are telling the computer what they want and not telling them how to do it in a command and control fashion is just a massive shift. That shift is so big that it really should, change our process and challenge our thinking on a lot of different things. Now, vibe coding. I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. It's already in Wikipedia, which should shock no one. But I liked the fact that in here it's saying a couple of things that I think are pretty controversial. So, right, so the first one is like users describe a problem in a few sentences as a prompt, to an LLM. Is that really how we do it? I don't know. Like vibe coding is kind of going back and forth. It's talking. It's not, like I say the thing and then all of a sudden it shows up, although there are some products that are trying to sort of make that model work. The LM generates software, freeing the programmer from having to write and debug the code. Not at all. You still have to debug the code, but the debugging is usually a conversation, right? It's working with the agent, not working entirely on your own, right? And then the idea that vibe coding is how amateur softwares produce software without training and skills. Again, maybe, right? But what I'm trying to convince you here is that I think that's actually a little bit of a stretch, and it really helps to have those skills. And there's a bunch of examples out here. I pulled this one from this weekend. Hey, I did all this great stuff, and Replit was awesome, and then all of a sudden deleted my production database, and I was screwed. And in this case, I think he recovered. But that's the sort of thing that happens with the truly roller coastery, vibey stuff. I prefer a model a little bit more like this, and credit to Andrew on the lower left about this framing, right? But I like the idea of prompt-driven development as being the thing that we're really doing here, because you still have the inbound and outbound pieces. You still have to figure out what you're doing. You iterate with the LLM as opposed to iterating with humans, generally speaking, and then you do have some process of like, well, yeah, this is part of the product now, right? Whether it's review and merge or whether it's just that you have a deployment process of your own, I don't know, but there is something going on here. Now, I want to talk briefly about tools just to sort of, get some things out of the way here. There's a zillion of these things. I actually do really like Lovable. I love Tempo. I think, there's really something to what they're doing in terms of like kind of a Figma replacement, a very, very limited tech stack. GitHub Spark is going to be a thing probably. There's Claude Code, there's Cursor, there's Gemini, and then I just left this in here. I like AMP. I have tried it and enjoy it, but everything is changing. I'm not going to talk about any of those today. I'm going to talk about Klein. And this has been my preferred tool for quite a long while now. This was originally called Claude Dev, but it actually, I think, arose, maybe early last year. And the reasons I like it are that I'm used to it, and I just want to be honest about this. Being used to a tool honestly means more than some other tool having some magic, right? That, all of a sudden, oh, I can do all these amazing things. Can you? Like, I mean, a lot of it is just, are you used to the tool in a way that makes you productive, not can the tool do this thing, in some magic way. Um, and I really don't care about token costs. And in fact, I've been pretty opinionated in various forums about, Cursor and other things like it are trying to cram you into a $20 a month box. And that really does ultimately sacrifice, a bunch of the quality of the experience. The more tokens you use, generally speaking, the more context you give the models, in a controlled way, the better result you get. So in my case, it's a combination of, I'm doing a lot of this stuff for work and therefore the tokens are worth it. And I won a whole bunch of credits in an Anthropic hackathon last year. So like I'm still very much in the black when it comes to Claude. I also see AI coding entirely as pair programming. Okay, pair programming and token cost really quick is just the amount of money that you have to spend to work with the LLMs. So I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. AI coding is pair programming. And what I mean by that is that I am not right now doing the asynchronous version of this. There are a lot of people out there, and you can find these people, on Twitter in particular, talking about, I did this thing and then I left and then Claude finished it by the time I got back. Hey, that may work for some things. I don't do that. I navigate Klein drives. It's a pair programming model, right? You are in it with the agent. You're just moving a lot faster because the agent's there. I also love IDEs. Therefore, I want something that kind of feels like, VS Code or whatever else it is, but I never got anything out of autocomplete. I don't really want, the LLM finishing my code sentences. I want it to do the thing, right? And that's really what this model is all about. I also really love the Klein UX. I'll show it to you in depth here. I don't really get the CLI thing aside from that, there are CLIs everywhere, right? And it's kind of geeky for programmers, to say that they love CLIs. I think Klein is a better version of this. And then I think last couple points, it was doing agentic RAG before it was a thing. And what I mean by that is that there's not some opaque vector database somewhere. This thing's reading files, and you can see it reading the files, and you can see it thinking. And for me, that's actually really powerful. And lastly, it's a very thin layer, right? It's doing a bunch of stuff, but it's not that much stuff on top of the smartest model you can afford, right? So if you can't afford a super smart model, cool. Like buy the one that you can afford. Klein will make it better. Klein will make it easier to work with. Okay. So now I want to jump into the thing that I built and give you some real examples of how I built it. So I have 3 teenage children. College is terrifying. I have a lot of opinions on college, but that's a whole other lightning talk. And I am trying to build myself first, and then ultimately possibly for others, a college counselor, right? Something that's going to help me go through the process and both provide information to the model, right? This is LLM powered, and then capture all that data and make it useful, right? So the thing I don't like about, let's say ChatGPT or Claude, when you're talking about, some important thing to you is that it's a chat. It's not something you have to either make your own list, you have to come back to the chat. Like you really don't have the power of coming up with the right user experience for the thing you're actually trying to get done. Million ways to get around that, but the main one is to write some software. So let's take a look. Let us see what this looks like. So I'm going to be very, very quick here, but the basic idea is that there is data that you provide the model up front, and I'll show you that in a second. And then there's, a bunch of stuff you want to do after you've essentially defined your target colleges and sort of gotten a bunch of information about them. And so this really was, and I built most of this over Christmas, a thinking model before thinking models were totally a thing. So you can see here that as I go through here, right, this is Claude. In this case, I also can do this with Gemini and OpenAI. Going through and thinking and using tools, running searches, through, in this case, a custom Google search engine, pulling back data and then processing that data and then thinking some more and then getting some college data, like stuff that we've actually processed, fetching, different things and reading them, and then coming out with an analysis, which then can be used to then generate things like a map of schools, which I'll show you, and a plan for how to apply to them and things that you actually want to do, to maximize your chances. And so a bunch of this is conventional software, right? This is, a lightly fictionalized version of my eldest daughter. This is stuff that you just type in, right? Your interests, you define all of these things. This is all context that essentially goes into the prompt, right? Then you get to the recommendations and you can sort of drill down, and then you get further and it's like, all right, here. So what schools am I looking at? Where are they? What do I know about them? Right? I'm a Williams graduate, so I'll be a Williams homer here for a second. This is data that the model gathered and then stuck in a map pin. And then if I wanted to, and this is one of the fun things that I'm working on, you can do like, a college tour, right? I'll pick the colleges that I want to see, and then I'll rearrange it in Google Maps, and then I sort of know what I'm up against. One of many things that I think goes into the college process. And my daughter's young enough that we haven't really done this yet, but we're about to. So I'll stop there for the demo. What I really want to show you is a couple of examples of things that I had to do as I was building this. Okay, so first thing on the build step, and I'll put this in slideshow for a second. I'll show you how I built the map, right? The prompt on the left, which I'll dive into in just a second, is really, my high level, requirement, right? It draws on things that I know from having built the rest of this with Klein, right? It draws on, my general idea of how I want things to work. But you can see here, this is purely text. I'm not sending it designs. I let, essentially Klein design this entire app, good and bad, right? I can certainly give it a facelift at some point. But my whole goal here is to get the most out of the model, which means I'm open to you telling me sort of what you think the right architecture is here. And then if it doesn't work, we'll fix it together. So let me show you what this looks like. So I've got to find the appropriate thing in here. One thing about Klein is it's not really built for this use case, which is finding past conversations really quickly. But let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so this is the kind of conversation that you can have with Klein, right? And so up here you can see, this is the task that I gave it. And then with Klein here, this little bar on the bottom, you can see all the costs and sort of the other things going back and forth, but you can see the process of thinking through these actions. Here's a file that the model read. Here's what it then said and sort of was thinking about. And then it usually comes back with these summaries, and I'll shrink this down. So, here's the first summary that it gave me, right? Let's have to scroll up a little bit, I think. Oh, somehow this one's missing. Anyway, then I start giving it feedback, right? And so this is me saying, hey, okay, I like what you did. Here's what I want you to change, right? So this is a back and forth that you would have as a pair programming something together with another human, right? It's not, I defined every single thing that I want to do, and I have this entire, sorry, I've got to admit some more folks in the waiting room. It's not that, I've got this entire thing, sort of totally figured out. I'm just passing it in a spec. You can do that, right? There are reasons you might want to do that. But for me, I really wanted this to be way more interactive, right? And so if I skip through here, you'll see, we get down through a whole bunch of stuff. And then, essentially, I get Klein. Sorry, I was trying to click on these things. Um, Oh yeah, so you can see here, this is an example where because I'm doing this in interactive mode, I can stop it when I know that it's going off the rails. Okay, so here's an example where, it's trying to do this thing and I'm like, no, 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 there's a thing you need to do first. So instead of saying yes or no, like accept, reject, whatever it is, I just talk to it and I just say, oh, there's a file you need to read first. Okay, then it reads it and it's like, all right, now I'll do what I was going to do and I'll do it, the way that you want it done. So this idea, and like I can see this entire conversation, it's a very, very long one, cost about $10, as you can see up here in the top. This is the kind of interaction that I have with Klein. And what I got out the end of it, right, was a fully functioning map. And you can see here when Claude actually finally declares victory, it's like, all right, I've taken all your feedback. We created this thing, right? Here's the stuff that, we did, because this also then goes into documentation. I took this and basically put this out, in what we call the memory bank, right? To remember what we did. And, the end result was this. This didn't exist. I had the conversation. Now it exists. Right. So that's the way that, I used Klein in particular to generate new features. Okay. Let me go to my next example. Deployment. So I mentioned that, I am a DevOps, sort of, I am maybe a DevOps hobbyist, someone who can casually have conversations and understand roughly what's going on in cloud applications. But I have never worked with Google Cloud before, right? I actually deployed to Google Cloud purely because I had some spare credits, right? I had like, $300 free or something from when I joined. So in this case, this is a conversation from the middle of the process, right? Klein understands, Claude understands DevOps way, way better than I do. And so what I was able to do was basically just take this. Again, I got to find this conversation real quick, so bear with me. Oh, wait, sorry, I've got to select my favorites first. Again, this is the one thing that is not optimized for our workflow here. Yep, so here it is. So what I get, right, is, a list again of operations and sort of things that, it wants to do. So the first thing Klein does is it checks the README, because in previous iterations, we had written down, essentially how to do the deployments, right? So I'm asking it a question. I'm telling it my problem, right? That I ran this command and it succeeded, but now I need you to help me deploy it. And then it starts actually doing it, right? Based on a combination of things it's written down and knowledge that it has from its training, right? It understands all the Docker commands I need. It understands all the Google Cloud commands I need. It figures out as things fail, right? That we need to do things like auth. None of this is rocket science, but the point is, I didn't have to know it, right? This is something that the model knows well enough to just do for me. And it made this entire thing possible. Whereas if I had had to stop and essentially become a Google Cloud person, in the middle of this project, I just wouldn't have done it. Right. So the value here is, that it accelerates these things that I sort of dimly understand how to do, but didn't understand well enough to actually execute. Right. So that's a quick example, but, the deployment part, in this case, Klein built the entire thing for me. I did not learn how to do Google Cloud deployments, right, as part of his process. Klein did that. So if I go on to the next step, refactoring. So this one I actually really like, and I'm just going to jump over and show you this in person. This refactoring example, came about sort of in the middle of my project when I realized that, fundamentally my layout just sucked, right? Again, I did not use a designer to execute this. But so if I go down here, yeah, so this is the chat right here. So the first thing, and I'll show you this briefly, this is what this used to look like, right? So without, so zoom this part in too. What this used to look like was this wizard flow, and it had like a bunch of different lines on things, and it had this heavy navigation, and the only space I had left for the chat was this little part at the bottom. Not great, right? So I identified this problem, without too much detail, gave it this screenshot. So that's the screenshot that I clicked, and then said, look, I want your help with this, right? So again, it starts with the memory bank. It starts to think through things. Then it starts to make a bunch of changes with my approval, right? So in this case, like, it is getting to a point, I'm trying to find the right thing. So it is basically decided, okay, well, to use a new sidebar layout, which is really just, the advice that I kind of gave it, as a collapsible vertical sidebar. That's the only real sort of direction I provided. It just starts doing stuff. And again, it's doing this, and I'm approving every one of these steps. I didn't just let it go off and go crazy, because I want to be able to step in. Then it gets to a point where, it says like, all right, let me see if we can do this. I jump in and I give my feedback, right? And I give it a new screenshot, right? Like, hey, here's the thing that it looks like now. right? There was a width problem, which we actually worked through and sort of, modified in a whole separate chat. But this kind of process, right? You can do this, right? With these agents, you can go back and forth. You can give them, peeks on your environment. You can work with them, right? There is a collaborative process here, right? That again feels a lot like pair programming. So again, the main point I want to show with all of this is just that this is a thing that requires, I think, you to be engaged in the process to get a good result. If you were to throw this entire thing, into, let's say, a Lovable, you would probably get back a really, really nice UX that you wouldn't understand how to deploy, you wouldn't understand how to iterate, and it's not clear that that interface is, the Lovable interface is sort of the right way to manage that software. Whereas for this, you're a lot closer to the metal, right? There's a lot more you can do, if you're just kind of savvy about how you provide it the right context. All right, in the interest of time, because I know we're coming up on the whole thing, the last thing I was going to show is just that, there's a lot of new features that I've got planned, right? So, I've actually started the plans, weeks ago, put them on the shelf, I have a full-time job, and I'm going to get back to them at some point. But I have these plans, kind of ready to work, and I can always come back and resume the conversation where I left it off. So, as a recap, before we stop for questions, I really like this semi-automatic mode. I know I didn't show it to you in action, but the idea of, there are certain things that are okay, to let the models do on their own. They can read anything they want. They can run safe commands. They might be able to edit certain files. But, why not? You really should be looking at the things that it's trying to write, because you may look at it and be like, hey, that's probably fine, but, I'd really rather that you did it, this way. Or, like that function's too long, like refactor it, break it up. So what you lose in speed, you gain in comprehension of the system. Klein and Claude really can, in my case, do pretty much anything if you know how to ask, right? I did not run into gaps that were so large that I couldn't figure it out by providing better context or by, essentially guiding it, giving it some new paths. I did have a couple of cases where in a really tricky, front end bug case, I actually sent it to O3, and O3 was a little better. It gave me some better ideas, of what to do. But ultimately, this whole thing was built by Klein and Claude with me watching, right? I did not write more than a handful of lines of code. Okay, so that said, with the whole thing, it really does help to know how to code. I'm not going to sugarcoat that part, right? If you don't know how to code, you absolutely can still get good results, but you'll get better ones if you know some of what's going on, if you understand a lot of the principles of hand coding. It really helps to understand basic things about software. It really helps if you understand how your app actually works, let alone anything else. Because you'll get into places where you're taking the model's word entirely for it, and you're not a very good partner, right? You're not a very good pair to it. And then lastly, you can generally take the agent's recommendations on code architecture, infrastructure, but you need to tell the agent if there are certain things you either do or don't want to do. And a lot of this is, make sure that you're good at sort of articulating the footprint you want. In my case, I wanted as little infrastructure as possible. I did want it to always, be up, right? It wasn't something where I wanted a transient, container, but like, I didn't want, dedicated hardware. I wanted it to find a way to run my little Docker containers, in the best way possible. And it was pretty good at that. Okay, I'm going to pause here and both give a quick shout out to my workshop, which is going to be scheduled for this Saturday. Please enjoy the code FAFO20. I think you can probably Google for what that means, but that is kind of what we're doing here, effing around and finding out. And I would love to see anybody there who's interested in going deeper. Again, it's going to be a combination of coding stuff like we just talked about and some opportunities to really use it, and agent workflows, which is a whole different thing that I didn't even get into, but which is actually what I do for sort of most of my professional work. Okay, thank you guys. I'm going to pause here. There's more in this deck, and I'll drop the deck link into the chat so you can have it, just about best practices and some other things to keep in mind. So let me drop that link in and then look for questions. All right, so any questions, please throw them in the chat if you don't mind, and I will try to get to them. And otherwise, barring that, feel free to just unmute. I don't have a problem with that. With the link, can view. Okay. All right, so here is the presentation. So in the chat is the presentation link. Feel free to grab that. That also does have my contact information at the very, very end, my email, but otherwise feel free to find me on LinkedIn. And the QR code that was earlier in the presentation also links directly to my LinkedIn, if that's helpful. Okay, so I'm looking back to some of the chats. So first, from Mike, what was your total cost from ideation to production? So a couple things on that. One interesting one is that I won enough credits in this Anthropic hackathon that I really was not cost conscious at all. And so one of the things about the semi-automatic mode is that if you walk away for 5 minutes, your cache invalidates and it has to read the entire thing back in. And that does dramatically blow up the cost of individual operations. So there are some of these things, like the single biggest, I think, operation that I ever did, and I can probably go prove this quickly, was something like $30. in one back and forth. But that was usually because I picked it up and I left it, and then I came back and the cache invalidated, and then I tried new things. So if I go to most expensive, yeah, so 34.74. I probably spent a total of, let me say, $400 in Claude tokens over a long period of time. So, it's a lot. But if you think about the $20 a month on Cursor adding up, and you think about the fact that you eventually run out of capacity. So if you're sprinting on something, with Cursor, you may just get to a point where you can't move, and you can't go any further, without paying for a different product. Okay, so that was total cost. Can Klein build monetization? Yes. So in this case, just again, I haven't gotten to this yet, and part of this is that I'm kind of trying to use the product myself first. If I go to newest, here's my plan for implementing Stripe, right? I gave it some basic parameters. I don't know if any of these are right? And I don't know anything about Stripe. Like, I have a Stripe account for Maven, but otherwise, like, I've never used it before. So a lot of this is like, hey, I'd really like you to go and do some research for me. Like, go and figure out, what's going on here. And one of the cool things about this is, I was able, I think, to get to a point where it went and just said, all right, cool, I need to go read the APIs myself. I was like, yeah, go for it. That's great. And so it went through this whole process and then came back, I think, essentially at the end and just said, yeah, so here's what I think you should do, right? And it knows enough about my code from having read both the documentation that it wrote and, pieces of new stuff to make a good recommendation, right? And it knows, based on the context I gave it, that I already sort of have something to build on. So monetization, yes. And then, yes, it is possible that I would recommend using Klein for functionality and then something else for different parts of it. So Lovable, I do like a lot, and Lovable can export a GitHub repo. So if you like better the process of getting to, a great prototype in Lovable, I'm all for it. I really do think those tools are great. I think to get to production, I at least ran into blockers there, right? I wasn't able to get a basic Lovable app to work with Supabase. I think it was mostly Supabase's fault. But the point is, like, that is something where you can pick whatever tool you think is better later. All right, so I will really quick, just because we're almost at the end of the time here, I will drop the link to the workshop in the chat. It is right here. And now folks can have that as well if you do not click through to the presentation. Okay, last question probably before we run out of time. Can Klein make use of Claude Pro? Yes, I actually haven't done that yet, again, because I have all these credits. Klein can use Claude Max, I think. And in fact, I'm going to double check in the settings whether that's actually like an explicit. So basically, they call it Claude Code here. So if you want to use Claude Code and you have a Claude Code Max plan, right, you essentially can set that up. It does have some limits. There's been stories about, Anthropic clamping down a little bit harder on those limits in recent weeks and days. But yes, you can do that. And that is a way to try to defray some of the token costs, assuming that, you don't max out. The nice thing about Klein is that if you do max out, you can go and do different models, right? So you don't have to stick with, the one model you started with. You can sub in things that are either much cheaper or, kind of the newest and greatest. Okay, looking at the time, we're right at 12:30. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun. And I look forward to seeing you out there, either on the internet or possibly at my workshop. So thank you again.